On October 15, 2023, 23 eighth graders from Millfield Middle School boarded a yellow bus for what should have been a routine geology field trip to Devil's Canyon, Colorado. By sunset that same day, every single one of them had vanished, without a trace. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. Mrs. Sarah Chen, a beloved earth science teacher with 15 years of experience, had planned this trip for months. The destination was Devil's Canyon, a geological formation 40 miles west of Denver, where students could collect mineral samples for their semester project. Make sure you bring your safety helmets and sturdy shoes, Mrs. Chen had reminded her students the week before. The smell of chalk dust and teenage energy filled room 204 as backpacks rustled and permission slips were signed. Bus driver Frank Martinez knew these mountain roads like the back of his weathered hands. As the bright yellow vehicle wound through the pine-scented Colorado wilderness that crisp autumn morning, students pressed their faces against condensation-streaked windows, pointing at elk grazing in distant meadows and snow-capped peaks piercing the brilliant blue sky. At exactly 10:47 a.m., Mrs. Chen sent her last text to the school principal. Arrived safely at Devil's Canyon. Weather perfect. Students excited. Will check in after lunch. That message would be the last communication anyone would receive from the group. When 4 p.m. came and went with no word from Mrs. Chen, a woman known for her punctuality, the school's anxiety began to mount. By 5 p.m., Principal Margaret Walsh was pacing her office, dialing Mrs. Chen's number repeatedly. Each call went straight to voicemail. At 6:15 p.m., as the Colorado sky began to bleed orange and purple, the first search and rescue team was dispatched to Devil's Canyon. What they found there would challenge everything they thought they knew about missing persons cases. The bus sat empty in the parking area, engine cold, doors wide open as if the occupants had simply stepped out and walked away. Mrs. Chen's purse remained on the driver's seat, her phone inside with a dead battery. The students' lunches were untouched in the cooler. But here's where the story takes its first disturbing turn. The search dogs, specially trained German shepherds, refused to pick up any human scent beyond the immediate area around the bus. They would approach the tree line where the group should have entered the canyon, then suddenly stop, whimpering and backing away as if encountering something that defied their every instinct. What had 23 children and their teacher discovered in those shadowy depths of Devil's Canyon that could make them disappear so completely? And why were the search dogs so terrified of following their trail? The answer would prove to be far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The search operation at Devil's Canyon transformed from a routine missing persons case into something far more mysterious as the first night fell over the Colorado wilderness. Sheriff Tom Bradley had coordinated dozens of search and rescue operations in his 20-year career, but he'd never encountered anything like this. The tactical lights mounted on the rescue vehicles carved harsh white circles through the darkness, illuminating the empty bus that sat like a yellow monument to the inexplicable. Emergency responders combed through every inch of the vehicle under the glow of portable floodlights. The metallic scrape of equipment echoed off the canyon walls as they documented evidence. Mrs. Chen's lesson plans lay scattered across her seat, pages fluttering in the mountain breeze. A half-eaten apple sat browning on the dashboard. 23. Student backpacks remained perfectly arranged in the overhead compartments, as if their owners had simply evaporated into thin air. The most unsettling discovery came when investigators examined the ground around the bus. The soft dirt parking area showed clear evidence of the group's arrival. 24 sets of footprints leading from the bus toward the canyon entrance. But then, impossibly, the tracks simply stopped. Not faded or obscured by wind, but literally ended, as if the entire group had been lifted from the earth itself. Detective Lisa Martinez, Sheriff Bradley's most experienced investigator, crouched beside the last visible footprint with her flashlight. The print belonged to a size 7 hiking boot, likely Mrs. Chen's. Beyond it, nothing but undisturbed earth stretched toward the tree line. The search dog's behavior became even more disturbing as night deepened. Rex, a 6-year-old bloodhound, with an impeccable tracking record, approached the end of the footprint trail and immediately began whimpering. His handler, Officer Mike Santos, had never seen the animal react this way. Rex's ears flattened against his head, and he backed away from the tree line with his tail between his legs, refusing to advance despite Santos's encouragement. 2 other dogs showed identical reactions. They would track the scent to the exact point where the footprints ended, then retreat as if encountering an invisible wall of terror. But it was the thermal imaging helicopter that revealed the most chilling detail. As the aircraft swept over Devil's Canyon in grid patterns, the infrared cameras detected something that made the pilot's blood run cold. Deep within the canyon, approximately 2 miles from where the footprints ended, 24 distinct heat signatures appeared on the screen, clustered together in what appeared to be a natural rock formation. The signatures were stationary. They weren't moving, weren't showing any signs of distress or attempts to signal for help. They simply existed, glowing white-hot against the cold Colorado landscape like ghosts frozen in digital amber. "Base, we've got them," the pilot radioed back, his voice tight with controlled excitement. 24 heat signatures, 2 miles southeast of the bus location. But as rescue teams prepared to rappel into the canyon at first light, something impossible happened. The thermal signatures simply vanished. One moment, they were there, clear as day on the infrared display. The next moment, the canyon showed nothing but the cold darkness of empty stone. What force could make an entire class disappear from the very spot where technology confirmed they were standing? Dawn broke over Devil's Canyon with an eerie stillness that seemed to mock the urgency of the search operation. As the first rescue team rappelled into the rocky depths where the thermal signatures had been detected, they discovered something that would change the entire direction of the investigation. The canyon floor, carpeted with centuries of fallen pine needles and decomposed granite, showed no signs of recent human presence. But tucked beneath a natural overhang of red sandstone, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look, was something that shouldn't have been there. A metal grate, roughly 3 feet square, set flush into the canyon floor. Rescue specialist Danny Chen, no relation to the missing teacher, brushed away decades of accumulated debris with his gloved hands. The grate was old, its surface pitted with rust and weathering, but the lock mechanism appeared to have been recently disturbed. Scratches around the keyhole gleamed silver against the oxidized metal, as if someone had worked at it with tools just hours before. The discovery sent shockwaves through the command center. Sheriff Bradley studied photographs of the grate, while FBI agents from the Denver field office were quietly contacted. This was no longer a simple missing persons case. It had the hallmarks of something far more sinister. Using industrial cutting tools, the rescue team breached the lock and lifted the heavy grate. A ladder descended into absolute darkness, its rungs disappearing beyond the reach of their headlamps. The air that wafted up from below carried a strange metallic scent mixed with something else, something organic and unsettling that made veteran rescue workers exchange worried glances. Danny Chen volunteered to make the initial descent. As his boots hit each rung of the ladder, the sound echoed through what was clearly a much larger space than expected. 30 feet down, his boots touched solid ground, and what his headlamp revealed defied all logic. The underground chamber stretched beyond the reach of his light beam, its walls carved from living rock, with a precision that spoke of professional excavation. This wasn't a natural cave. It was a deliberately constructed space, complete with electrical conduits running along the ceiling and what appeared to be ventilation shafts disappearing into the darkness. But most disturbing of all were the clear signs of recent habitation. Emergency blankets lay crumpled in one corner. Empty water bottles were scattered across the floor, and there, etched into the wall with what looked like a piece of sharp stone, were the words, "Help us, Day 2. The handwriting was shaky, but recognizable to anyone who had graded 8th grade assignments. It was Mrs. Chen's distinctive cursive, script. As Danny's radio crackled to life, calling for immediate backup and a full forensics team, he noticed something else that made his skin crawl. The chamber wasn't empty. It was part of a larger complex. Multiple tunnels branched off from the main space, disappearing into the mountain like the arteries of some vast hidden heart. From somewhere deep within those tunnels came a sound that no rescue worker ever wants to hear underground. It was faint, almost inaudible but unmistakable. The echo of human voices calling out in the darkness. They were still alive. But what was this place? And who had built this elaborate underground facility beneath Devil's Canyon? More importantly, what did they want with 23 children and their teacher? Within 6 hours of the underground facility's discovery, Devil's Canyon resembled a military operation more than a rescue mission. Tablak-Twabi, SUVs with government plates wound up the mountain roads in single file, their tinted windows reflecting the Colorado sun like obsidian mirrors. Special Agent Rebecca Hayes stepped out of the lead vehicle with the measured precision of someone accustomed to controlling crisis situations. Her FBI credentials commanded immediate respect from local law enforcement, but it was the additional personnel who followed her that raised eyebrows among the search teams. Men in dark suits with earpieces and unmarked patches on their tactical gear, the kind of federal agents who appeared when situations transcended local jurisdiction. The transformation of the rescue operation was swift and decisive. A perimeter was established around the entire canyon, with armed guards positioned at every access point. Media helicopters that had begun circling the area were ordered away by federal aviation authorities. The story that had begun as a missing school group was suddenly classified beyond the reach of curious reporters. Sheriff Bradley found himself relegated to a supporting role in his own investigation. Agent Hayes delivered her briefings with clinical efficiency, but her explanations raised more questions than they answered. "The facility you discovered is part of an ongoing federal investigation," she informed the assembled local authorities. "For national security reasons, we'll be assuming primary responsibility for this operation." But what kind of federal investigation involved a hidden underground complex in rural Colorado? And why had no one mentioned this facility when 23 children went missing directly above it? The technical equipment that followed the federal agents was unlike anything the local rescue teams had ever seen. Ground-penetrating radar. Systems mapped the full extent of the underground network, revealing a complex that stretched nearly half a mile in multiple directions beneath the canyon floor. Specialized communication equipment was lowered into the chambers, attempting to establish contact with the missing group. The first breakthrough came at 3:47 p.m., when electronic monitoring equipment detected faint radio transmissions from deep within the facility. The signals were weak and fragmented, but voice analysis confirmed what everyone hoped to hear. Mrs. Chen was attempting to use her emergency radio to call for help. "Can anyone hear us? This is Sarah Chen, Millfield Middle School. We're trapped. Don't know how. Got down here." The transmission faded to static before more could be understood, but it proved the group was alive and had found some way to access the deeper levels of the facility. However, Agent Hayes's reaction to the radio contact was troubling. Instead of celebrating the breakthrough, she immediately ordered all local personnel cleared from the communication equipment. "We need to establish secure channels before proceeding," she explained, but her tone suggested something far more complex than a simple rescue operation. As night fell over Devil's Canyon for the second time since the disappearance, the federal presence continued to grow. Mobile command centers were established. Satellite communication arrays pointed toward the stars. And most ominously, a convoy of unmarked trucks arrived carrying equipment covered in military-grade tarps. The families of the missing children, who had been allowed limited access to the search area, were suddenly relocated to a hotel 30 miles away for their own safety. Parents who demanded answers were met with polite but firm federal agents who spoke in vague terms about ongoing operations and classified security matters. But what government operation could possibly justify the disappearance of innocent children? And why were the federal authorities more concerned with secrecy than with rescue? The answer lay buried in classified documents dating back decades. Documents that revealed Devil's Canyon's dark history as something far more sinister than a simple geological formation. The truth about Devil's Canyon lay buried in a dusty filing cabinet in the basement of the Denver Federal Building, where retired FBI analyst Martha Rodriguez made a discovery that would crack the case wide open. Martha had spent 30 years processing classified documents for various government agencies before her retirement in 2019. When news of the missing school group reached her through local media, something nagged at her memory, a fragment of a case from her early career that shared troubling similarities with the current situation. Working through the night in her home office, Martha accessed archived files through her retained security clearance. What she found in a 1987 incident report made her blood run cold. Project Underground Sun, a classified Department of Energy operation that ran from 1984 to 1989, had used Devil's Canyon as a testing site for experimental underground facilities designed to house sensitive government operations during Cold War tensions. The project involved drilling extensive tunnel systems into the mountain, creating what was essentially a hidden bunker complex, disguised as natural geological formations. The project had been abandoned after a catastrophic incident in the summer of 1989. According to the heavily redacted report, 12 researchers working in the facility simply vanished without explanation. The last radio transmission from the underground complex spoke of impossible readings and containment failure before communication was lost entirely. The facility was sealed and classified as a permanent restricted zone, but budget cuts in the early 1990s had led to reduced security monitoring. The project's existence was buried in classified archives, known only to a handful of federal officials who assumed the site would remain permanently inaccessible. Martha's phone call to Agent Hayes at 2:30 a.m. changed everything about the rescue. Operations priorities. "You need to know what you're dealing with," Martha told the agent, her voice shaking with the weight of decades-old secrets. That facility wasn't just a bunker. They were conducting experiments down there. Something involving geological anomalies and electromagnetic fields that they never fully understood. The archived files revealed that Project Underground Sun had been investigating reports of unusual magnetic disturbances in Devil's Canyon, phenomena that seemed to affect electronic equipment and even human perception in ways that defied conventional science. The research team had been attempting to harness these natural anomalies for potential military applications when the 1989 incident occurred. Most disturbing of all was the final project report, stamped with the highest security classifications. The lead scientist, Dr. Marcus Webb, had documented strange temporal distortions within the deeper chambers, spaces where time seemed to move differently. where radio signals arrived before they were sent, where personnel reported experiencing events that hadn't yet occurred. Agent Hayes read the declassified excerpts with growing alarm. If the archived reports were accurate, the missing children weren't just trapped in an underground facility. They were trapped in a place where the normal rules of physics didn't apply. The federal response suddenly made horrifying sense. This wasn't a rescue operation. It was a containment protocol. The government agents weren't there to save the children. They were there to prevent whatever had happened in 1989 from happening again. But as Martha Rodriguez discovered in the final pages of the archived report, the 1989 incident hadn't ended with the disappearance of the research team. 6 months later, they had been found. Not in the facility, but scattered across 3 different states, with no memory of how they'd arrived there, and no explanation for the 5 years that had mysteriously passed during their 6-month absence. What was happening to Mrs. Chen and her students in the depths of Devil's Canyon? And how could the federal government justify keeping 23 families in the dark about the true nature of their children's disappearance? The clock was ticking, but in the twisted reality of Project Underground Sun, time itself might be the enemy. 2 days after their disappearance, Mrs. Chen and her students existed in a reality that defied everything they thought they knew about the world above ground. The underground facility stretched before them like a metal and concrete maze, illuminated by fluorescent lights that hummed with an otherworldly frequency. The air tasted metallic and charged with electricity, making their skin tingle and their hair stand on end. Most disturbing of all, their watches had stopped working the moment they'd descended into this place, leaving them with no way to track the passage of time. Mrs. Chen gathered her students in what appeared to be a central chamber, her teacher's instincts overriding her own terror as she saw the fear in their young faces. 13-year-old Marcus Johnson clutched his geology notebook with white knuckles, while Jenny Martinez kept checking her phone for a signal that would never come. "Stay together," Mrs. Chen told them, her voice echoing off the metallic walls. "Whatever happens, we stay together." But staying together proved more difficult than anyone could have imagined. The facility seemed to shift around them, corridors appearing where none had existed moments before, doorways leading to chambers that defied the laws of architecture. Students who walked 10 feet ahead would suddenly vanish around corners that led nowhere, only to reappear behind the group with no memory of how they'd gotten there. 8-year-old Katie Fuller was the first to notice the temporal distortions. She had been drawing in her sketchbook when she realized that her pencil marks were appearing before she made them. Lines and shapes materializing on the paper as if guided by an invisible hand from the future. The walls themselves seemed alive with purpose, covered in displays and monitors that flickered with data streams the students couldn't comprehend. Occasionally, fragments of conversations would emerge from speakers embedded in the ceiling. Voices, speaking about dimensional stability and temporal confluence in urgent, professional tones. Mrs. Chen's emergency radio crackled to life intermittently, picking up transmissions that seemed to come from multiple time periods simultaneously. She heard her own voice calling for help, but the timestamp indicated the transmission was from 3 days in the future. She heard unfamiliar voices discussing their rescue operation, but referring to events that hadn't happened yet. The most unnerving discovery came when they found a chamber filled with personal belongings, backpacks, clothes, and equipment that looked decades old, but bore the unmistakable marks of previous visitors. Name tags and ID badges scattered across metal tables revealed the identities of the 1989 research team, their possessions preserved as if their owners had just stepped away for a moment. Among these artifacts, Mrs. Chen found a journal written by Dr. Marcus Webb, its pages filled with increasingly frantic observations about the facility's effects on human perception and the flow of time itself. The final entry, dated 6 months. After the team's disappearance, described their desperate attempts to find a way back to their own timeline. The facility exists in a temporal fold, Dr. Webb had written in barely legible handwriting. Past, present, and future converge here. We see ourselves arriving, leaving, living, dying, all simultaneously. The children who come after us will experience the same convergence. Time is not linear here. It's a web, and we're trapped in its center. As Mrs. Chen read these words aloud to her terrified students, the facility around them began to pulse with a rhythm that seemed almost biological. The lights dimmed and brightened in sequences that felt like breathing. The walls hummed with frequencies that resonated in their bones, and from somewhere deeper in the complex came a sound that made their blood freeze. The echo of children's voices singing a familiar song, but the melody was wrong, distorted, as if it were being sung. Backward through time itself, were they hearing their own voices from the past or the future? In the twisted reality of Devil's Canyon, the distinction no longer mattered. While their children existed in a temporal nightmare beneath Devil's Canyon, the families of the missing. Students waged their own desperate battle against a government wall of silence and bureaucratic obfuscation. The Riverside Inn, 30 miles from the canyon, had become an impromptu headquarters for 23 families whose worlds had collapsed in a single afternoon. The hotel's conference room buzzed with the desperate energy of parents who refused to accept the vague assurances of federal agents. Maria Martinez, Jenny's mother, and a prominent civil rights attorney, had transformed from grieving parent into a fierce advocate for answers. Her laptop computer glowed with research as she worked through the night, using every legal resource at her disposal to penetrate the wall of classification that surrounded her daughter's disappearance. "They're lying to us," she announced to Satsutitos, the assembled parents at their daily briefing. The federal response is completely disproportionate for a simple rescue operation. There's something down there they don't want us to know about. David Johnson, Marcus's father, and a former military intelligence officer, had reached out to his network of contacts in various government agencies. The responses he received were uniformly evasive, but the pattern itself told a story. Every call I make gets transferred to the same department, a division that officially doesn't exist, he reported to the group. My security clearance has been temporarily suspended pending resolution of the current situation. They're treating this like a national security incident. The parents' frustration reached a breaking point when Agent Hayes called another briefing to deliver what amounted to no new information. Her practiced responses about ongoing operations and classified protocols rang hollow in the face of their desperation. "My daughter has been missing for 3 days," shouted Robert Fuller, Katie's father. "I don't care about your classifications. I want to know what happened to my little girl." Agent Hayes maintained her professional composure, but careful observers noticed the stress lines around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. She was clearly under pressure from her own superiors to maintain secrecy while managing increasingly agitated families. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Martha Rodriguez, the retired FBI analyst who had discovered the Project Underground Sun files, arrived at the hotel unannounced at 10 p.m. on the third night. Her weathered face carried the weight of decades of government secrets, but her voice was steady as she addressed the assembled parents. "Your children aren't just missing," she told them quietly. "They're trapped in a facility that the government has been trying to pretend doesn't exist for over 30 years. The revelation sparked chaos in the conference room. Parents shouted questions, demanded explanations, threatened legal action. But Martha's calm presence gradually restored order as she began to reveal the classified history of Devil's Canyon. She spoke of Project Underground Sun, the 1989 disappearances, the temporal anomalies that defied scientific understanding. She showed them photocopies of declassified documents that proved the government had known exactly what their children were walking into when they chose Devil's Canyon for their field trip. The site should have been permanently sealed, Martha explained. Someone failed to maintain the security protocols. Your children stumbled into a place where time itself doesn't work the way it should. The parents' anguish transformed into focused determination. If the government wouldn't save their children, they would find another way. Maria Martinez began drafting legal injunctions to force disclosure of classified information. David Johnson reached out to investigative journalists who specialized in government cover-ups. But the most significant development came when Dr. Eleanor Webb, daughter of the original Project Underground Sun leader, contacted Martha Rodriguez after seeing news coverage of the disappearance. "I have my father's personal research notes," she told Martha over a secure phone line. "The ones he kept hidden from the government. If there's a way to get those children out of there, the answer is in those notes." As the fourth day dawned over the Colorado mountains, two separate rescue operations were taking shape: the official federal containment protocol and a desperate parent-led effort to uncover the truth that might save their children. But, in the twisted timeline of Devil's Canyon, 4 days might already be 4 years, or 4 minutes, or 4 decades. The race to save the missing students wasn't just against time, it was against time itself. Dr. Eleanor Webb arrived at the Riverside Inn carrying a battered leather satchel that contained her father's life's work, and potentially the key to saving 23 trapped souls. Eleanor was a theoretical physicist at MIT, but her professional credentials paled beside the personal burden she'd carried for over 3 decades. Her father, Dr. Marcus Webb, had never recovered from his experience in Project Underground Sun. The man who emerged from Devil's Canyon after 6 months wasn't the same brilliant scientist who had descended into its depths. In the hotel conference room, surrounded by desperate parents, Eleanor opened the satchel with reverent care. The documents inside were written in her father's increasingly erratic handwriting, chronicling his growing understanding of the temporal anomalies that plagued the underground facility. "My father never stopped researching the phenomenon," Eleanor explained, her voice heavy with inherited trauma. "Even after the government classified his work and forced him into retirement, he continued his investigations. He believed he could find a way to stabilize the temporal fields and prevent what happened to his team from happening to others." The research notes painted a picture of a brilliant mind grappling with forces beyond conventional physics. Dr. Webb had theorized that Devil's Canyon sat atop a natural geological formation that created what he called temporal confluence zones, spaces where the normal flow of time became distorted and unreliable. The underground facility, rather than causing these anomalies, had actually been built to study and potentially harness them. The 1989 disaster occurred when the research team attempted to amplify the natural temporal fields, inadvertently creating a cascade effect that trapped them outside normal space-time. "But here's what the government never understood," Eleanor continued, pulling out a series of hand-drawn diagrams that looked more like abstract art than scientific notation. "The temporal fields follow predictable patterns. They pulse in cycles, creating windows of stability approximately every 72 hours. Maria Martinez leaned forward, her attorney's mind immediately grasping the implications. "You're saying there's a specific time when the facility returns to normal? Physics?" Eleanor nodded grimly. "For approximately 30 minutes every 3 days, the temporal distortions stabilize enough to allow normal entry and exit from the facility. My father calculated that the next stability window would occur at exactly 3:17 a.m. Mountain Time, which is less than 18 hours from now." The room erupted in urgent conversation, as parents realized they had a specific deadline for action. But Eleanor's next revelation silenced them all. "There's a catch," she said quietly. "The stability window can only be accessed from inside the facility. Someone already trapped in the temporal fields can use the window to escape, but people from outside can't enter during the stable period. The physics work one way, but not the other." David Johnson, with his military background, immediately understood the tactical implications. "So we can't mount a rescue operation during the window. The children have to save themselves." "Exactly. And they need to know when the window will occur." Eleanor pulled out a complex calculation filled with temporal mathematics. "The stability window will last exactly 28 minutes and 37 seconds. If they miss it, they'll be trapped for another 3 days, assuming they can survive that long in the temporal flux." The parents stared at the equations with growing desperation. How could they communicate this critical information to children trapped in a place where time itself was broken? Mrs. Chen's emergency radio had made sporadic contact, but the transmissions were garbled by temporal interference. Martha Rodriguez studied Dr. Webb's notes with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades analyzing classified documents. "There's something else here," she said, pointing to a section of research marked with her father's most urgent notations. He believed that the temporal fields were getting stronger, not weaker. Each stability window might be less stable than the last one. Eleanor's face went pale as she read the passage Martha had identified. "He's right. The facility is degrading. The temporal confluence is becoming more chaotic. If our calculations are wrong, if the next window doesn't occur as predicted." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the stakes. 23 children and their teacher had less than 18 hours to receive information that might save their lives, transmitted through a communication system that defied the laws of physics, in a desperate gamble based on the secret research of a man who had been driven to the edge of madness by the very forces they were now trying to understand. But as the parents organized their desperate communication attempt, none of them realized that time in Devil's Canyon was already moving differently than they calculated. The next stability window wasn't 18 hours away. For the trapped students, it had already begun. Inside the facility, Mrs. Chen felt the change before she understood it. The constant electrical hum that had vibrated through the walls for days suddenly shifted to a lower frequency, and the fluorescent lights stopped their maddening flicker to burn with steady intensity. "Everyone stay calm," she called to her students as they gathered in the central chamber. The temporal distortions that had plagued them seemed to be stabilizing. Their stopped watches suddenly began ticking again, all synchronized to 3:17 a.m., though none of them could remember seeing that time approach. The facility's intercom system crackled to life with unprecedented clarity, and through it came a voice none of them expected to hear. Dr. Marcus Webb, speaking from 30 years in the past. "If you can hear this message, you're experiencing a temporal stability window," the recorded voice explained with scientific precision. "You have approximately 28 minutes to reach the surface exit before the fields destabilize again. Follow the blue emergency lighting to Sector 7. Do not deviate from the marked path." As if responding to his words, a series of blue LED strips began illuminating along the walls, creating a pathway through the facility's maze-like corridors. Mrs. Chen quickly organized her students into a single-file line, conducting a rapid head count to ensure all 23 were present and able to move. But the journey to Sector 7 revealed the true scope of their temporal prison. As they followed the blue lights through chambers they had never seen before, they encountered evidence of multiple time periods existing simultaneously. In one room, they glimpsed the 1989 research team at their workstations, completely unaware of the students passing through their past. In another, they saw their own future selves returning to explore the facility, decades older and bearing the weight of unimaginable experiences. "Don't look at yourselves," Mrs. Chen warned urgently as several students stopped to stare at these temporal echoes. Dr. Webb's research notes mentioned that direct observation of temporal duplicates could destabilize the window. The blue lighting led them through increasingly narrow corridors, past rooms filled with equipment from different decades, through chambers where the air itself seemed to shimmer with temporal energy. Some students reported seeing their parents in the facility, searching for them with equipment that wouldn't be invented for years. Others glimpsed federal agents examining their abandoned belongings in investigations that spanned multiple timelines. Jenny Martinez stumbled when she saw her own mother, decades younger, working as a researcher on the original Project Underground Sun team. The temporal confluence had revealed that Maria Martinez's connection to Devil's Canyon went far deeper than anyone had realized. She had been part of the original research that created this nightmare. The stability window was holding, but barely. Mrs. Chen could feel the familiar electrical tingle returning to the air, and the blue emergency lights began to flicker ominously. They had perhaps 10 minutes remaining before the facility collapsed, back into temporal chaos. Sector 7 turned out to be a vertical shaft leading directly to the surface, equipped with an industrial elevator that looked like it belonged in a mining operation. But as they crowded into the elevator car, the temporal fields began fluctuating wildly around them. Through the facility's intercom came a new voice, Agent Hayes, speaking from the current timeline above ground. "Mrs. Chen, if you can hear this, abort the ascent immediately. The surface is not secure. Federal containment protocols are in effect." Mrs. Chen's finger hesitated over the elevator controls. Were they escaping to safety, or climbing toward a different kind of prison? The government agents above clearly knew more about this situation than they had revealed to the families. But the choice was made for them when young Marcus Johnson reached out and pressed the button himself. "We can't stay here forever," he said with wisdom beyond his 13 years. As the elevator began its slow ascent toward the surface, the temporal stability window collapsed around them. The facility below returned to its chaotic temporal state, but they were rising through normal space-time, climbing toward whatever awaited them in the world above. What they found when the elevator doors opened would reveal the true scope of the conspiracy that had trapped them, and the shocking reason why the government had been so desperate to keep their disappearance. Classified, the elevator doors opened onto a scene that looked nothing like the Devil's Canyon the students remembered. Instead of the natural rock formation where they had begun their field trip, they emerged into what appeared to be a high-tech laboratory facility built into the mountainside. Armed guards in hazmat suits immediately surrounded the elevator, their weapons raised but not threatening. Behind them, banks of monitoring equipment registered their emergence with urgent beeping and flashing alerts. Agent Hayes stepped forward, her face visible through the visor of her protective gear. "Nobody move," she commanded, but her voice carried relief rather than hostility. "We need to run decontamination protocols before you can be released." Mrs. Chen stepped protectively in front of her students, her teacher's instincts overriding her confusion and exhaustion. What kind of decontamination? What happened to Devil's Canyon? Agent Hayes exchanged glances with her technical team before answering. "Mrs. Chen, I need you to prepare yourself for some difficult news. According to our monitoring equipment, you've been missing for 2 weeks. But, according to the atomic clocks, you've aged approximately 6 months during your time in the facility." The revelation hit the group like a physical blow. Students looked at their hands, touched their faces, suddenly aware of subtle changes they hadn't noticed during their ordeal. Their hair was longer, their clothes looser, their faces carrying a maturity that hadn't been there during what felt like only days underground. The decontamination process revealed the true scope of what they had experienced. Medical scans showed cellular changes consistent with months of life experience compressed into an impossible time frame. Blood tests detected trace elements that shouldn't have existed in their systems, isotopes from different temporal periods that had somehow become part of their biology. But the most shocking revelation came when Agent Hayes led them to an observation deck overlooking what had once been Devil's Canyon. The natural rock formation was gone, replaced by a massive excavation site where hundreds of workers in protective gear operated heavy machinery around a concrete containment structure. The REARM temporal anomaly has been expanding since your disappearance, Agent Hayes explained, her voice heavy with implications none of them fully understood. Your emergence triggered a cascade effect. The facility below is now bleeding temporal energy into the surrounding area at an unprecedented rate. Through reinforced windows, they could see the evidence of temporal contamination spreading across the landscape. Trees aged decades in seconds, then reverted to saplings in the span of minutes. Wildlife moved in stuttering patterns as they slipped between different time streams. The very air shimmered with chronological distortion. Mrs. Chen realized with growing horror that their escape hadn't ended the crisis. It had accelerated it. Are you saying we caused this? Not caused, Agent Hayes corrected grimly. Triggered. The facility was always unstable. Your presence during the temporal window created a resonance effect that destabilized the entire containment system. The implications became clear as they watched the containment operation below. This wasn't a rescue site. It was a disaster response. The government wasn't trying to hide their disappearance. They were trying to prevent a temporal catastrophe that could affect the entire region. How long do we have? Mrs. Chen asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Agent Hayes consulted readings from her monitoring equipment. Our best estimates suggest the temporal field will reach critical instability within 72 hours. If we can't re-establish containment by then, the effects could cascade across half of Colorado. The students stared at the devastation below, finally understanding why their families had been relocated, why federal agents had taken control of the situation, why their simple school field trip had become a matter of national security. But the most disturbing realization was yet to come. As they watched the containment operation, several students began pointing at the workers below with growing excitement and confusion. "Is that my dad?" Marcus Johnson asked, pressing his face against the observation window. Mrs. Chen followed his gaze and felt her blood run cold. Among the hazmat-suited figures working around the containment structure, she could clearly recognize several of the parents, not as visitors or observers, but as technical personnel operating specialized equipment with professional expertise. The families who had been fighting so desperately for answers about their children's disappearance weren't innocent bystanders caught up in a government conspiracy. They were part of the cover-up itself. The reunion between the rescued students and their families took place in a sterile medical facility 30 miles from the containment site. But the emotional homecoming the children expected never materialized. Instead, they found themselves facing parents whose relief was tempered by a terrible knowledge they had been hiding for decades. Maria Martinez knelt before her daughter Jenny, her hands shaking as she examined the subtle changes that 6 months of compressed time had wrought on her child's face. But when Jenny looked into her mother's eyes, she saw something that chilled her to the bone. Guilt. "Mom, why were you at the containment site?" Jenny asked quietly. "Why were you wearing hazmat gear like you knew what was happening down there?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. And one by one, the other children began asking similar questions of their own parents. David Johnson avoided his son Marcus's gaze as he spoke in technical terms about temporal containment protocols. that no civilian should have understood. Robert Fuller's hands bore the calluses of someone who operated heavy machinery, despite his supposed career as an insurance adjuster. Dr. Eleanor Webb, who had seemed like their salvation, stepped forward to address the assembled families with the weight of inherited truth. "The children deserve to know the real reason they were chosen for this field trip," she announced, her voice cutting through the whispered conversations. The parents fell silent, their faces carrying the burden of a secret that had defined their entire adult lives. Martha Rodriguez, the retired FBI analyst, moved to stand beside Eleanor as the terrible truth began to unfold. "Project Underground Sun didn't end in 1989, Eleanor explained to the shocked students. "It evolved. After my father's team was rescued from the temporal facility, the government realized they had stumbled onto something with unprecedented potential. Rather than abandoning the research, they decided to study the long-term effects of temporal exposure. The implications hit the students like physical blows. Their parents, people they had trusted completely, had been part of an ongoing experiment that used their own children as test subjects. The 12 researchers who were rescued in 1989 all exhibited remarkable changes," Martha Rodriguez continued, her clinical tone unable to mask the horror of what she was revealing. "Enhanced cognitive abilities, extended lifespans, an intuitive understanding of temporal mechanics. The government wanted to see if these traits could be passed to their children." David Johnson finally met his son's eyes, his voice breaking as he spoke. "We were told it was safe, that the field trip was just observational, that you would never be in any real danger. The temporal field was supposed to be completely contained." But Mrs. Chen, still protective of her students, despite her own shock and betrayal, stepped forward with growing anger. "You used us. You used children as experimental subjects, without their knowledge or consent." The parents' explanations tumbled out in a cascade of justification and regret. They spoke of government contracts that paid for their children's educations, of medical monitoring that they had been told was routine, of psychological evaluations disguised as standardized testing. For over a decade, their children's entire lives had been shaped by their connection to Project Underground Sun. "The field trip wasn't random," Maria Martinez admitted, tears streaming down her face. "You were all selected because you're second-generation temporal exposure subjects. Your parents were part of the original research, and we were monitoring you for inherited traits." The students stared at their families with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. Everything they thought they knew about their lives had been a carefully constructed lie. Their friendships, their school placement, even their selection for Mrs. Chen's geology class, all of it had been orchestrated by government researchers studying the long-term effects of temporal contamination. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. Agent Hayes approached the group with a tablet computer displaying real-time readings from the containment site, her expression grim with urgency. "The temporal cascade is accelerating," she announced. "We have less than 48 hours before the field reaches critical mass, and according to our calculations, the only way to re-establish containment is to send someone back into the facility, someone who has already been exposed to the temporal fields and can navigate them safely." The room fell silent as the implication became clear. The children who had just escaped from a temporal nightmare were being asked to return to it, not as victims this time, but as the only hope for preventing a catastrophe that could affect millions of people. The parents who had orchestrated their children's involvement in this conspiracy now faced the ultimate consequence of their choices. Would they sacrifice their children again to save the world from the monster they had helped create? The weight of the decision fell heaviest on Mrs. Chen, who found herself caught between her protective instincts as a teacher and the terrifying reality of the expanding temporal crisis. Through the facility's reinforced windows, she could see the containment site where the temporal field pulsed like a malignant heart, growing stronger with each passing hour. Agent Hayes spread detailed schematics across the conference table, her voice clinical as she explained the mission parameters. The plan was devastatingly simple in concept. A small team would need to descend back into the facility during the next stability window and manually reset the containment systems that had been damaged during their escape. The temporal exposure you've already experienced makes you uniquely qualified to navigate the facility's unstable zones, she explained to the assembled students. Your cellular structure has adapted to temporal fluctuations in ways that normal humans cannot achieve. But adaptation came with a price. Medical scans revealed that each student now carried temporal markers in their DNA, genetic changes that would affect not only their own futures, but potentially their children and grandchildren. They had become something new, something that existed partially outside normal space-time. Marcus Johnson, the boy who had pressed the elevator button during their escape, stepped forward with the quiet determination that had marked him as a natural leader throughout their ordeal. "How many people live in Colorado?" he asked Agent Hayes. "Approximately 5.8 million," she replied, understanding the direction of his question. Marcus looked around at his classmates, his young face carrying the burden of an impossible choice. "So we're talking about saving almost 6 million people by risking 24 lives." The mathematics of sacrifice hung in the air like a physical weight. Mrs. Chen wanted to object, to find another solution, to protect her students from yet another betrayal by the adults who were supposed to keep them safe. But the monitoring, equipment's urgent alarms, and the visible expansion of the temporal field outside left no room for denial. "There has to be another way," she insisted, though her voice carried little conviction. Dr. Eleanor Webb shook her head sadly. "My father spent 30 years looking for another way. The temporal fields can only be stabilized from within, and only by someone who has already been integrated into the temporal matrix. Adults who try to enter the facility without prior exposure suffer immediate cellular breakdown." The students exchanged glances, filled with a communication that went beyond words. Their shared experience in the facility had created bonds between them that transcended normal friendship. They had seen each other's futures and pasts, had witnessed the temporal echoes of their own lives played out in endless variations. Jenny Martinez was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "We're not the same people who got on that bus," she said quietly. "We can see things differently now, feel time moving in ways that other people can't." One by one, the students began describing the changes they had noticed since their emergence. Katie Fuller could sense temporal disturbances before they occurred. Several others reported dreams that turned out to be glimpses of alternate timelines. They were becoming something beyond human, and that transformation carried responsibilities. They were only beginning to understand. The parents watched in anguish as their children discussed returning to the nightmare that had already changed them irrevocably. David Johnson grabbed his son's shoulder, his voice desperate. "Marcus, you don't have to do this. Let the government find another solution." But Marcus gently removed his father's hand, his eyes holding a sadness and wisdom that belonged to someone far older. "Dad, there is no other solution. And after what you all did to us, after the lies and the experiments, we don't trust the government to keep looking for one." Mrs. Chen realized that her students had grown beyond her ability to protect them. They were making choices based on knowledge and abilities that she couldn't fully comprehend. But she could still stand with them. "If you're going back down there," she said firmly, "I'm going with you." Agent Hayes started to object, but Mrs. Chen cut her off. "I'm the only adult who's been exposed to the temporal fields. I'm the only one who can navigate the facility alongside them, and I'm not letting my students face this alone. As the next stability window approached, now less than 12 hours away, the volunteers prepared for a mission that would either save millions of lives or trap them forever in the temporal maze beneath Devil's Canyon. But what none of them realized was that their decision to return had already been made in countless alternate timelines, and somewhere in the facility's twisted reality, their future selves were waiting to help them complete a mission that transcended time itself. The second descent into Devil's Canyon felt like diving into the heart of a temporal storm. Mrs. Chen led her volunteer team of 12 students, those who had shown the strongest adaptation to temporal exposure, through the facility's entrance as reality warped and twisted around them. This time, they came prepared. Each team member wore monitoring equipment that tracked their temporal displacement, and they carried specialized tools designed by Dr. Eleanor Webb based on her father's hidden research. But preparation meant little in a place where cause and the effect existed in a state of constant flux. The facility had changed during their absence. Corridors led to rooms that hadn't existed before, filled with equipment from timelines that might never come to pass. Emergency lighting flickered between different spectrums of visibility, and the air itself seemed to pulse with chronological energy. "Stay together," Mrs. Chen called out, though her voice echoed from multiple time periods simultaneously. "Remember, we're not just moving through space, we're moving through time itself." Their mission was to reach the Central Control Room, ADE chamber deep within the facility where the original containment systems could be manually reset. But getting there required navigating temporal zones where past, present, and future existed as physical locations rather than sequential moments. Marcus Johnson, whose leadership abilities had been enhanced by temporal exposure, guided the team using instincts that defied normal logic. He could sense the flow of time around them, feel the currents of causality that would carry them toward their destination or trap them in temporal loops. In one chamber, they encountered themselves from the first mission, watching their own desperate escape play out like a recording. In another, they glimpsed possible futures where their mission failed and the temporal cascade consumed the entire western United States. But the most disturbing encounter came when they reached a corridor filled with versions of themselves from alternate timelines. Teams that had made different choices, failed in different ways, succeeded through different sacrifices. These alternate selves tried to warn them about dangers ahead, while others attempted to convince them to abandon the mission entirely. "Don't listen to them," Jenny Martinez urged her teammates as they pushed through the crowd of temporal echoes. "They're not really us. They're possibilities that we can choose not to become." The Central Control Room, when they finally reached it, looked like something from a science fiction nightmare. Banks of monitors displayed temporal data streams that hurt to look at directly, while control panels covered with switches and dials seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Dr. Marcus Webb, not a recording this time, but some kind of temporal imprint of the original researcher, appeared to guide them through the shutdown procedure. His image flickered between different ages, sometimes appearing as the young scientist who had first discovered the anomaly, sometimes as the broken man who had emerged from 6 months of temporal imprisonment. "The containment field must be collapsed gradually," his shifting image explained. "Too fast, and the temporal energy will cascade outward. Too slow, and the facility will achieve critical mass before shutdown is complete." The shutdown procedure required precise timing and coordination. Each student was assigned specific control sequences that had to be executed in perfect synchronization across multiple temporal streams. Mrs. Chen coordinated their efforts while monitoring the facility's structural integrity through sensors that registered stress across time as well as space. As they began the shutdown sequence, The facility fought back. Temporal defenses activated, creating maze-like distortions designed to confuse and disorient intruders. The very walls shifted through different time periods, sometimes trapping team members in temporal loops where they relived the same moments over and over. But the students had been changed by their exposure to the facility's fields. They could perceive the temporal patterns, anticipate the shifts, and maintain their course even when reality itself seemed to rebel against their presence. The moment of truth came when the final control sequence required someone to manually stabilize the central temporal core, a task that would expose them to potentially lethal levels of chronological radiation. Without hesitation, Mrs. Chen stepped forward to complete the sequence herself, but Marcus Johnson moved to stop her. "This is why we came back," he said simply. "We're already changed. We can survive this in ways that you can't." As Marcus approached the temporal core, his body began to glow with the same chronological energy that powered the facility. The other students joined him, their combined will and adapted biology creating a stabilization field that began to calm the chaotic temporal streams. The facility's shutdown wasn't an ending, it was a transformation. As the containment field collapsed in controlled stages, the temporal energy that had been trapped for decades finally found release, carrying with it the students who had given everything to save millions of lives they would never meet. The aftermath of the facility's shutdown defied every attempt at official explanation. When the temporal field finally collapsed, Devil's Canyon returned to its natural state. But the 12 students and Mrs. Chen, who had sacrificed themselves to save Colorado, were nowhere to be found. Agent Hayes stood at the edge of what had once been the most classified site in the American West, now reduced to an ordinary geological formation that showed no trace of the underground complex that had existed there for decades. Monitoring equipment registered normal background radiation levels. The temporal distortions that had threatened to consume half the state had simply vanished. But the story didn't end with their disappearance. Over the following months, reports began filtering in from across the country. Sightings of the missing students and their teacher appearing at moments of crisis, always when someone needed help that defied conventional possibility. A family trapped in a burning building in Chicago reported being guided to safety by a group of teenagers who seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts. A lost hiker in Alaska described being found by a woman matching Mrs. Chen's description, who led him through a blizzard to safety before vanishing into the snow. The students' families, burdened by guilt and grief, gradually came to understand that their children hadn't died. They had transcended the normal boundaries of time and space. Security cameras occasionally captured glimpses of familiar faces. In crowds, always at moments when disaster was prevented or lives were saved through impossible interventions. Dr. Eleanor Webb dedicated her remaining years to studying these phenomena, ultimately concluding that the students had become something unprecedented. Temporal guardians who existed outside normal causality but remained connected to the world they had saved. "They're not gone," she explained to the grieving parents during one of their monthly support group meetings. "They've become part of the fabric of time itself. They exist in the spaces between moments, in the possibilities that save lives and prevent tragedies." The government quietly classified the entire Devil's Canyon incident at the highest levels of secrecy, but leaks inevitably occurred. Conspiracy theorists and paranormal investigators descended on the area, searching for evidence of the facility that had supposedly never existed. They found nothing, because there was nothing left to find in conventional reality. But Mrs. Chen's sister, visiting the site on the anniversary of her disappearance, reported seeing a group of figures standing at the canyon's edge during sunset. They appeared to be teenagers and an adult woman, watching over the landscape with expressions of peaceful satisfaction before fading into the golden light. The truth about what happened to the missing class of Millfield Middle School became one of those stories that official sources denied, but witnesses never forgot. Parents occasionally reported dreams where they spoke with their children, conversations filled with reassurance that their sacrifice had meaning, and that love transcends the boundaries of time itself. The temporal anomaly that had threatened Colorado was gone, but its legacy lived on in the changed lives of those who had witnessed the impossible. The surviving families formed an unbreakable bond, united by their shared knowledge of children who had become something beyond human understanding. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right through Devil's Canyon, locals report hearing the faint sound of young voices carried on the air, not crying for help this time, but singing with joy, their melody echoing across timelines that stretch from past to future and back again. The missing class had found their way home at last, not to the world they had left behind, but to a place where time itself welcomed them as guardians of the impossible. If this story left you as impacted as it did me, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. Because in a universe where time can be broken and mended by the courage of 13-year-olds and their teacher, who knows what other impossible truths are waiting to be discovered?